The sand wasn't moving. It hadn't moved in 6 years. Then something small crossed it. Slow, deliberate, no bigger than a forearm. 40 of them went in. Not coral, not fish. Not a single dollar of hand-planted fragment. Just 40 animals, lowered into a dead reef, flat off Lombok, Indonesia. The man holding the collection bag was Dr. Gilles Bourdeau, marine biologist, Institut de la Mer, Montpellier. He had planned for 18 months of slow baseline data. The reef had other plans. I'm Dr. Raymond Finch. I spent 40 years watching ecosystems collapse, and far less often, watching them remember what they were. What Bourdeau found in that first week, I could not explain away with a model. The reef had been biologically inert since 2012. 6 years of silence, no recruitment, no settlement. Just pale sediment baking under equatorial light. Within 72 hours of deployment, the sediment surface showed measurable bioturbation across the trial zone. No restoration budget had ever produced that result. Not in 72 hours, not even close. Each animal ingests sediment continuously, processing up to 19 kilograms of sand per year per individual. They expel it chemically altered, nitrogen recycled, alkalinity raised. The floor was waking up from the inside. Bourdeau had set his first monitoring checkpoint at 8 weeks. He moved it to day 5, then day 3. The data arriving on his tablet described a substrate that should not have been responding yet. Not by any timeline his models recognized. Millions had been spent across the Indo-Pacific planting coral fragments by hand. Those fragments needed substrate chemistry that nobody had prepared. The cucumbers were doing what every other program had skipped. And here is the detail that stopped Bourdeau cold. The sand wasn't just moving. Coral larvae, pelagic, drifting, looking for somewhere to grip, were beginning to settle in zones the cucumbers had crossed. Not where they hadn't. Across the broader Indo-Pacific, sea cucumber populations had already collapsed, harvested by the ton for luxury markets before anyone asked what they were holding together. What 40 animals showed in Lombok would change that question entirely. The divers came back smiling. Fish had returned to the shallows off Lombok. Color was creeping back into certain colonies, and the tourism operators photographed it all. Recovery, they said. Success. But Bourdeau had been taking cores, not photographs. Cores. The top 3 centimeters of the seabed, the precise layer where polyp adhesion either happens or it doesn't, had lost carbonate alkalinity to levels incompatible with larval settlement. Historically, a functioning Indo-Pacific reef flat carried roughly 35 holothurians per 100 square meters. By the time Bourdeau deployed, that density had collapsed to fewer than 2. The floor had been functionally emptied. The geographic record of that collapse reads like a list of places the market ate alive. In the Coral Triangle, commercial harvesting removed an estimated 40,000 metric tons of holothurians annually through the 1990s. The nitrogen cycling beneath those reefs failed, and coral recruitment rates dropped by more than half. Off the northern coast of Madagascar, population surveys in 2003 found fewer than 3 holothurians per 100 square meters on reefs that once held 30. And juvenile coral coverage fell in direct proportion to that loss. Across the Great Barrier, Reef's inshore zones, harvest pressure through the 1980s left sediment nitrogen loads so elevated that larval settlement rates fell to a fraction of what pre-harvest cores had recorded. Along the Maldivian atolls, by 2005 commercial extraction had reduced holothurian biomass to near zero on reefs visited by fishing vessels. Within a decade of removal, test cores showed the seabed had turned anaerobic, visibly black. Nobody in the restoration industry was looking at the floor. 40,000 metric tons removed every year through that decade, and the dominant question was still, why won't the coral hold? Restoration programs had, by the 2000s, invested millions planting coral fragments by hand, a technique that works beautifully when the chemistry is right. It rarely was. The fragments were gripping a floor that could not receive them. Each holothurian processes up to 19 kilograms of material per year, turning organic waste into bioavailable nitrogen, lifting alkalinity precisely where a larva needs to grip. Remove the animal, and that chemistry stops. It does not slow. it stops. What the Lombok trial had begun to prove was not that 40 individuals could heal a damaged zone. It was something harder to accept, that the restoration program spending millions had been solving the wrong problem entirely, and the right solution had been harvested away before anyone thought to ask what it did. The wrong problem. That phrase stayed with me for a long time after I first read Bordeaux's field notes. Between 2005 and 2017, programs across the Indo-Pacific collectively spent an estimated $350 million planting coral fragments by hand, trained divers, controlled nurseries, continuous monitoring, every dollar aimed at the coral itself, and not $1 aimed at the sediment beneath it, where the chemistry that decides survival actually lives. Dr. Bordeaux documented nursery-grown fragments at a degraded site near Lombok. At the 24-month mark, fewer than 18% of those fragments had survived. Not because the coral was defective, because the sand beneath it was still chemically dead. The sediment was still accumulating organic waste. Nothing was processing it. The surface layer remained too acidic for polyp adhesion to hold, and every planted fragment paid the price of that neglect. In 2016, the Indonesian Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries reviewed the cost figures. The room went quiet. Some sites had spent the equivalent of $4,000 per surviving colony. And the colonies were still dying. That number deserved institutional outrage. What it produced was institutional silence. There is a difference. And the difference matters enormously when the sand is still dying while the meeting ends. The sea cucumber requires no salary, no dive team, no nursery. It has been processing sediment at roughly 19 kilograms per animal without a management plan for 400 million years. Nothing we built comes close to that engineering. The resistance was not malicious. It was structural. Funding mechanisms rewarded visible interventions. Coral fragments you could photograph. Nurseries you could show a donor. Outcomes that looked good in a press release. Sea cucumbers moving slowly through dark sand do not photograph well. Bordeaux spent 3 years approaching grant bodies to fund a density trial. 3 years. Every application rejected. He finally found a private conservation partner willing to cover the cost of exactly 40 animals. And that is where this story begins to turn. What he recorded in those 40 deployments, the bioturbation, the pH shift, the larval settlement beginning within 72 hours, was data that $350 million had failed to produce. The question now was whether the institutions that spent that money were willing to read it. The data Bordeaux read back at Institut de la Mer did not arrive as a single revelation. It arrived as a sequence, one physical event triggering the next, each one documented, time-stamped, and impossible to dismiss. Within 3 weeks of placement, the top 3 centimeters of the trial zone had shifted chemically. That layer, 3 centimeters, is exactly where a coral planula touches down and decides whether to attach or drift away and die. Each of the 40 animals was processing substrate at roughly 19 kilograms per year, excreting it with elevated pH and restructured nitrogen compounds the floor had not seen in 6 years. By week 6, Bordeaux's team measured coral larval settlement in the trial zone running at 4 times the rate of the untouched control area directly beside it. Their own predictive model had placed any meaningful improvement at month 9. They were looking at it in week 6. A number that should not have been possible had arrived 3 months ahead of schedule in a substrate the model had treated as biologically inert. Nobody on the team had a mechanism ready for it. That is the part that made Bordeaux move his monitoring checkpoint. Again, the cascade kept building. By month 4, surgeonfish and rabbitfish, 2 species of grazing fish that had been absent from the zone, were logging measurably longer feeding passes over the trial area, drawn by the microbial mat. The chemically active floor had begun to generate. Then, at month 8, Bordeaux's team found something the grant bodies had not funded anyone to look for. One juvenile coral colony, wild, unplanted, calcifying entirely on its own. A substrate that had recruited nothing for 6 consecutive years had produced a wild settler in month 8. Not a fragment, not a transplant. A larva that found the floor habitable and stayed. The cucumbers had not built anything. They had rebuilt the conditions, the chemistry, the microbiology, the nitrogen cycling, under which the reef could build itself. The architecture of that floor had reorganized around 40 animals. 40. What Bordeaux submitted to the journal was not a restoration report, it was a chain reaction log. And the institutions that had backed six-figure fragment programs were now facing a question the data had already answered, which left only one problem: what to do about the reefs where the cucumbers themselves had been fished to local extinction. The models had been specific 40 to 60 individuals over 24 months, enough chemical turnover to sustain the recovery without overworking the sediment beneath it. That was the projection. That was what the calculations said a contained introduction would produce. By month 14, Bordeaux's survey counted an estimated 180 individuals across the same area. The original 40 had reproduced juveniles from surrounding reef areas, were tracking inward along a chemical gradient. The improved sediment had begun broadcasting into open water. The system had recruited its own workforce. Nobody had modeled for that. Not the recruitment pull, not the density overshoot. Not what happens when the animals doing the work multiply fourfold beyond the planned ceiling inside a bounded area. You cannot fault the calculation. You can only watch what the system decided to do with it. The outermost 15 meters of the area were now being turned at a pace the nutrient cycling calculations had never anticipated. For 6 consecutive weeks in the second year, a sediment plume pushed into adjacent water. Light penetration dropped over a stand of recovering branching coral sitting 20 meters outside the planned boundary. Some of those branches bleached. Bordeaux documented it without softening the language. A real, measurable cost sitting directly alongside the success numbers in the same report. That is what honest field science looks like. It does not pick which results to publish. This is the part that made me stop and reread the field notes. The fish survey, which had been running as a secondary metric, came back with 23 species foraging across the area that had not appeared once across 6 years of pre-restoration baseline records. Not 2 or 3 opportunistic visitors, 23. The target had been sediment pH. Nobody had budgeted for fish. Nobody had written a fish recovery plan or submitted a grant application to fund one. The fish came because the sediment chemistry changed, and the biodiversity followed the chemistry the way smoke follows heat. No restoration program had planned for those 23 species. None had taken credit for them. Because you cannot take credit for something the system produced entirely on its own schedule, by its own logic, in its own sequence. That is the part the grant applications were not written to capture. What Bordeaux had published in 2019 described a recovery. What his second-year logs described was a system behaving like a system, overshooting, self-correcting, producing consequences nobody had scheduled. And one question inside those logs had no answer yet. The bleached branches outside the boundary had begun showing new polyp growth by the end of that same year. A population that had caused damage was now neighboring a recovery it had not been designed to produce. Whether that recovery rate held, and whether the overshoot itself had accelerated it, was a question the next survey season would have to answer. And that survey was already running. When Bordeaux filed his 24-month report in early 2020, the number at the bottom of the core sample analysis stopped him. The sediment alkalinity reading from the trial zone had climbed to a level the reef had not recorded since the early 1980s. 40 years of chemical damage, partially reversed by 40 animals in 24 months, not through any engineered intervention, through the uninterrupted, unglamorous chemistry of digestion. 40 years of sediment damage. That is the number that sits at the center of this story, not as a miracle, but as a straightforward demonstration of what happens when a missing biological function is returned to a waiting substrate. Each of those 40 animals processes up to 19 kilograms of sand per year. Multiply that across a population that had grown to an estimated 180 individuals by month 14, and the volume of reworked substrate becomes measurable in tons, not grams. The reef had been biologically inert for 6 years before Bordeaux's deployment. No recruitment, no settlement, no signal of return. The substrate was chemically hostile to the larvae that would have rebuilt it. The cucumbers changed that chemistry from the inside out, grain by grain. The reef programs that spent millions planting coral fragments by hand were treating the wall, not the foundation. The substrate those fragments needed to survive in had never been prepared, because the organism that prepares it had been harvested out of existence. Bordeaux wrote in his final report that the result was not surprising to him. It was humbling. The reef had held the chemical memory of what it needed to become. It simply required the organism that unlocks that memory to be present again. Remove the pressure, return the missing function. The substrate moves back toward the state it held for millions of years. Not because the ocean forgives, but because the physics of return are stronger than the physics of damage. They always have been. Drop your region in the comments, and name one species you have personally watched disappear from your local waters or coastline in your lifetime. And yes or no in the comments, have you ever seen something come back that you were certain was gone for good? Because if the answer is yes, I want to hear that story. Share this with someone who still believes the damage is permanent, because the evidence from a reef flat off Lombok says otherwise. I'm Dr. Raymond Finch. I'll see you in the field. Next, 9 adult American alligators reintroduced into a restored Florida Everglades marsh corridor produced a measurable increase in wading bird nesting density within a single breeding season, a result projected to take a decade. The South Florida Water Management District spent 27 years and more than $2 billion on hydrological engineering in that same corridor before the alligators arrived in 2017. And the marsh still would not function for the birds that needed it. When a living organism consistently outperforms the infrastructure built to replace it, the question the data keeps asking is whether the infrastructure has become the problem.